مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الأصل الأوركي لا يكون بمنأى أبدا عن عناوين الأنباء. الشهر الماضي كان محور التركيز هو الاتهامات الموجهة إلى الشرطة بالوحشية. هذا الشهر تكشفت حقائق عن قيام أحد كبار زعماء الكونغرس بإلقاء خطاب أمام جمع من العنصريين البيض. عدم المساواة الأوركية التي تعود أصولها إلى العبودية ربما تكون خطيئة أمريكا الأصلية، ولكنها ما تزال تطاردنا اليوم. وفي حين أن الحرب والاحتجاجات أدت إلى تغير هائل، ربما تكون التغيرات الأكثر جذرية قد حدثت من خلال النظام القضائي. ولا توجد منظمة ناضلة بقوة أكبر أو لفترة أطول أو حققت نجاحا أكبر في سعيها للمساواة القانونية والسياسية من الجمعية الوطنية لتحسين أوضاع الملونين أو NAACP. هذا الأسبوع في برنامج داخل واشنطن سنناقش المعركة القانونية لأجل العدالة والمساواة في أمريكا مع رئيسة صندوق الدفاع القانوني للجمعية الوطنية لتحسين أوضاع الملونين ليزلي برول. Welcome back to Dakhil, Washington. I'm sitting here with Leslie Prohl. Leslie, thank you. Welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start at the beginning. What is the mission of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund?
Well, the Legal Defense Fund is our country's oldest civil rights legal organization. We were founded in 1940 by Thurgood Marshall, who argued the Brown versus Board of Education case and went on to become our country's first African-American Supreme Court justice. And our mission is to identify and redress racial discrimination anywhere it may arise. We have 4 different project areas, kind of the way we organize our work. It's political participation, which involves voting rights. It's economic justice, which involves addressing housing discrimination, employment discrimination, lending discrimination. Our third area is education, which involves school desegregation at the K through 12 level, or affirmative action in higher education, universities, admissions to universities. And our fourth area is criminal justice, to make sure that racism does not infect the criminal justice process.
And what is the relationship between the Legal Defense Fund and the NAACP itself?
We used to have a formal relationship. We used to be connected. And in 1957, we officially separated as 2 distinct organizations. We have different boards of directors, we have different offices, different staffs. We work in tandem with the NAACP, but we are a distinct organization and have been since 1957. And just to simplify it even a little bit more, they are a membership organization. The NAA is very famous for having chapters in virtually every community around the country, and we more or less consider ourselves the lawyers, because we do a lot of litigation and we do a lot of federal policy work, but we do not have a membership.
Let me go now to 30,000 feet. Barack Obama is elected president of the United States, not once, but twice. Is racism alive, dead, or in intensive care in the United States?
Unfortunately, it is alive and well, as certainly the recent events in Ferguson and other places have shown us. I will say that there is no question that the election of our first African-American president was hugely significant in terms of civil rights history and the progress we have made in civil rights. But at the same time, when that happened, we encountered a difficulty that we had never encountered before, and that is that a lot of people thought with that election didn't it mean that we are in a post-racial society, that discrimination no longer existed? If the people of the United States chose to put an African American into the presidency, and we spent a lot of time in those first years kind of explaining the types of discrimination that still exists, that people still have problems with discrimination on their job. There's still segregated schools that we have to address. There's still racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. And so we certainly welcomed that historic moment, but it created somewhat of another hurdle for us to explain to basically the masses that discrimination still exists, and we will really be in business until it does not.
Let's take a closer look, if we can, at the 4 different issue areas that you identified as core to your agenda. Let's start with economic justice. Now, economic justice doesn't sound like it's a racial issue. Poor people can be white or black or any color. Is it a racial issue, and how does it affect the work that you do?
Well, we work on economic justice from the racial lens. I mean, the civil rights statutes that were passed by Congress in the 1960s addressed fair employment practices to make sure that people can receive jobs without discrimination, that they can be promoted to jobs without discrimination, and that they can not be fired for racial reasons. Same thing with the Fair Housing Act in 1968, that there should be open and accessible and fair housing, that you should have equal access to housing opportunities. And so that is the economic justice that we work in. You know, many of our clients end up being lower income African Americans because they are less likely to be able to acquire legal assistance than if you're a middle income person. You can hire a lawyer. We end up representing a lot of people who cannot afford lawyers, but there are incredibly systemic problems still existing across the landscape in employment, in housing. We're actually working on a very important fair housing case that the Supreme Court will hear 2 days after our country celebrates Martin Luther King's birthday. And the question before the court is whether a long-standing tool called the disparate impact tool, which allows you to challenge discrimination that is systemic, not on an individual basis, but that affects a lot of people, whether that tool, which really has been embedded into civil rights jurisprudence for over 40 years, will continue to exist. It is a very important case, and we're trying to get the word out about the high stakes and all of the communities that this will end up impacting if this tool is struck down.
Political participation, voting, and access to political life. How serious a problem is this in America today, especially for people of color?
Hugely important to our democracy. Just the kind of fundamental premise of the United States is based on everybody being able to participate equally in the political practice, in the political process, and to be able to elect representatives at the local, at the state, at the national level. We are fully engaged on trying to get Congress to update and restore a part of the Voting Rights Act that was struck down last year by the Supreme Court. It really gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act that was a stalwart for protection against discrimination. And we were not successful last year with Congress in getting them to restore and update the Voting Rights Act, but the Congress just started again, the 114th Congress here in Washington, and we will be going to them asking them that they do that this year. And I should also say that this year, 2015, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And you know, there's this new movie out that is being talked about so much about kind of the story of Martin Luther King's journey to Selma, and the Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March that ended up being the catalyst for the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And so in this 50th anniversary year, we think it's particularly important that Congress move to restore the Voting Rights Act.
And just so our viewers understand, in theory, all Americans could have voted for many decades, but the Voting Rights Act did precisely what to enable Black Americans to vote?
There were mechanisms that were adopted, particularly in the southern part of the United States, that essentially blocked African Americans from voting. They had to take literacy tests. They had to know the particular provisions of our Constitution. They had to answer questions that no white voter ever had to answer. And so Congress believed, rightfully so, that they needed to take federal intervention to guarantee that those types of tests and practices that blocked blacks from voting would be eliminated. And that was the Voting Rights Act that passed in 1965. And since then, there have still been tremendous obstacles posed to voting for African Americans. The kind of more current version of the literacy test and the voting test that blacks had to take was something now that states require a photo identification of African Americans, sometimes that they don't have. If they can't afford to buy a car, they don't have a driver's license, and it's very expensive and time consuming and burdensome to require everybody to have a photo ID. So it is disproportionately impacting the African American community. And so we have sued about those requirements, just as the civil rights lawyers did back in the 60s over the literacy tests and the other forms of exclusion. We have brought our present day challenges to these new kind of creative requirements that essentially prevent still African Americans from voting in the numbers that they could be.
Okay, we'll be back in just a moment to talk more about the work of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund here in Washington. Leslie Prohl is the director of the Washington office of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, overseeing the organization's vital policy and legislative work in our nation's capital. That means she leads strategy on such things as federal civil rights legislation, and she monitors the appointment of judges, including to the Supreme Court. Prior to joining the Legal Defense Fund, Leslie was a civil rights lawyer in Birmingham, Alabama for almost a decade. She is a woman of many firsts. She founded the first fair housing organization in her state of Alabama, and she was the first woman chair of the Alabama State Bar Labor and Employment Section. She began her career as a law clerk to the chief judge of a U.S. District Court in Alabama. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of California at Berkeley and her law degree from the University of California at Davis School of Law. So let's move to criminal justice. What's top of the agenda? Ferguson, Missouri.
Ferguson, yes. This is the instance in which a young unarmed man, Michael Brown, was killed by an officer on the streets of Ferguson. His body laid in the street for 4 hours, and we believe that there was absolutely no reason that this unlawful use of force, this deadly use of force, should have been used by this officer. And what it has done, it has started, or I should say reignited, a national conversation about bias against the African American community in the way that this country does its policing.
So is the charge against the officer as much as against the grand jury that decided not to indict the officer? Where's the critique?
Both places. I mean, we believe the officer should have been indicted. We believe that any officer who uses this excessive force, particularly against the African American community, in a demonstration of either implicit or explicit bias, should be held accountable. And what the grand jury did is they basically let him off. They refused to allow the prosecution to go forward. And we have complained at length about the way that that was handled. And in fact, just recently we have asked for the appointment of a special prosecutor to basically restart that grand jury process because there was so much wrong with it. And you know, this is not only isolated in Ferguson. We have seen incidents before Ferguson. We have seen incidents after Ferguson where the same thing happens. And it is something that I hope will not be in vain. It is a moment that it's turning into a movement about how we promote transparency and accountability and better training and better practices for our local law enforcement agencies.
And the last of your four major topics, education. What's the top item on your education agenda?
We spend a lot of time these days trying to eradicate something called the school to prison pipeline. And that is where young African American youth are mistreated, are over disciplined, are sometimes written up, arrested, and sent to the local police agencies for behavior that used to warrant just a visit to the principal's office, and now those students are incurring arrest records and juvenile records and criminal records that end up staying with them for the rest of their life. And it is a huge problem in the schools of the United States because it is a reaction to a lot of different things, zero tolerance of misbehaving in schools, drug policies, and it is something that is really over impacting the African American community, and we are trying to do education and promote practices that decrease the over penalization of African American youth in the education system.
Now you specifically focus on legislation and policy issues here in Washington. What would you say are the top one or two legislative items on the agenda that you hope Congress, and I'm about to ask you what the shift in the elections will do to this, but that you hope Congress will address on this agenda?
Sure. The first one would have to be criminal justice reform. I think that for the civil rights community not to take advantage of this national conversation that's going on about these issues and press Congress to enact some bipartisan criminal justice reforms, that would be malpractice on our part. I think it is incumbent for us to try to advance the ball as much as we can with this new Congress. I think the second thing would be to update the Voting Rights Act, to take advantage of this 50th anniversary of arguably the most important civil rights statute that our country ever passed, and make sure that everyone can equally participate in our political process.
So now, Republicans hold both houses of Congress. To what extent is there sympathy in certain parts of the Republican Party for either or both of these initiatives? And if there isn't, how do you go about achieving your objectives in this hostile political environment?
Well, let me say this. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund is a nonpartisan organization. We do not support Democrats. We do not support Republicans. We look for friends wherever we can find them. And civil rights traditionally has to have bipartisan support. Many of the early civil rights statutes in the 1960s that was passed by Congress came from support with both Republicans and Democrats. And Republican presidents have signed a lot of our country's best civil rights laws. And so we don't view civil rights as a partisan issue. I mean, certainly it is fair to say that it is a little bit harder to move our agenda when certain people are in leadership and are in office. And we probably have had more success in convincing our Democratic representatives than our Republican representatives to pass civil rights legislation.
Early in our conversation, you said that we won't be going out of business until racism in America disappears, or something to that effect. Are we getting close?
Well, I tell you, we are celebrating our 75th anniversary this year.
We as the LDF?
The Legal Defense Fund. We were founded in 1940, and we have been very busy, ever since. And we have accomplished a lot. We brought the famous Brown versus Board of Education, which first dismantled school segregation across the country. But there are challenges every day, and I think racism and bias comes up now in more covert, harder to detect forms, but it doesn't mean that it's any less injurious to communities of color. And so I unfortunately think that we will be still in business, at least for my lifetime, but I'm hoping at some point as our population changes, as kind of the country as a whole grows to accept the strengths of our diversity and the fact that difference is good, and that difference teaches us a lot about ourselves, that there will be less of a need for organizations like the Legal Defense Fund.
Leslie Prohl, thank you for joining us in Dakhil, Washington. I can only hope that you work yourself out of a job.
Thank you so much.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول التقدم نحو المساواة الأمريكية في أمريكا، أرجو أن تتصلوا بي مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.